I just couldn't resist a little cold open for this one. After a series of recent videos covering villains, fusions and amalgams, it got me thinking about all the amalgam forms we see in the series. I've covered Aggregore's amalgam form at length now, even giving my own take on species I would have chosen to put together if I was in Aggregore's shoes. But taking a step back from that, I wanted to cover the character who introduced us to amalgams in the first place. Kevin's introduction to the series introduced us to what was in Classic the biggest bad Ben had to worry about besides Vilgax. In a series revolving around an alien device, alien threats and all sorts, to have such a prominent villain being from Earth felt like a nice element to bring into the series, especially a villain who's a similar age to Ben. In case you're not familiar, Kevin's an osmosis, which depending on the series can mean different things. As far as the Classic series is concerned, Kevin has the mutant or osmosis ability to absorb energy from just about anything. Or as he puts it,
I was born with it. I'm like an energy sponge. Motors, air conditioners, lights, batteries, whatever. Soak it up, then dish it out when I have to. Or want to.
So going into his first appearance, all he's really used as a source is various technology, which nicely sets up the thought that maybe he could absorb the energy stored inside the Omnitrix. But let's circle back to the osmosian term I mentioned earlier. Come Alien Force, that was expanded on, giving us the explanation that Kevin's an alien hybrid along with the reasonable handful of other characters. This being a result of Kevin's dad Devon being presumably fully osmosian, belonging to that same species as Aggregore, who all have the same energy absorption abilities. Though come Omniverse, this is expanded on again. Turns out osmosians are not a real species. Devon is revealed to be a series of fake memories planted in Grandpa Max's head by Cervantes, so that Max would feel somewhat compelled to watch over Kevin later on, meaning Devon never existed in the first place. I've talked about all of this before in bits and pieces, but it feels quite weird to say it all together in order. There's a series of statements by Derek J. Wyatt to back all of this up if you're interested, but that's probably enough background for now. Let's get into the topic of today's videos and all of Kevin's amalgam forms. If you haven't watched all the way through to Omniverse, stick around. One of these forms we see come Omniverse is easily one of the best we see at all. Before we get into this proper, if you enjoy this style of content, please consider subscribing. Otherwise, if you're already subscribed, great, let's get back into it. In the Classic series, after absorbing energy from the Omnitrix, Kevin gets 2 partial Omnitrix transformations in Heat Blast and later Forearms, followed by a handful of fully realised transformations in his return in the episode Framed. I've always had a bit of a soft spot for those sort of incomplete partial transformations. I would have quite liked for his subsequent transformations to all have followed that design style, though it would take away from that titular framing that happens in episode. And beyond that, the idea that Kevin is being forced to take an alien form, having to concentrate to stay human even briefly, nicely sets up that this isn't an ability he has great control over just yet. Skipping forward to the end of the episode, and my favourite scene from not just the Classic series but the entire franchise, we get the transformation sequence revealing Kevin's first amalgam form. After defeating Kevin, Ben goes on to tell Kevin he's not even worth finishing off, which really gets under Kevin's skin, sending him spiralling, losing control of his ability to regulate the energy he's absorbed, causing his first real mutation into the Classic series amalgam. Being this, and forgive me for this sort of cheesy terminology, perfectly imperfect mix of the original 10 Omnitrix transformations. I love this design wholeheartedly. It's possibly outrightly my favourite design in the series. The proportions are just perfect, everything somehow meshes so well despite being so segmented. I love just how top heavy he is. Something about the bulky proportions on the Heat Blast arm just works so well for me. The Wildma arms as his additional limbs is great. The Accelerate tail, the Stinkfly wings, the way Upgrade's pattern goes down his back, I wouldn't change a thing. As a kid, I wasn't so crazy on Grey Matter's eye, but I've come to love it. And from its introduction, there's something so pleasant about any action scene involving this form. Even just him moving about the place casually is so pleasant to watch. I can't imagine the work that would have gone into storyboarding and animating his movements. It's hard to wrap my head around how they didn't make him feel goofy. I'd like to go on and list a few memorable moments, but there's really only a handful of fights including him, and they're all phenomenal. As a small standout, him unhinging his jaw and showing off the Ripjaw's ability was nice. I'd be curious if his body changes at all underwater. Beyond that, seeing as an ectoneurote's consciousness is in every bit of their DNA, and seeing as Kevin is part Ghost Freak, assumably there's a bit of a scare in there somewhere. Beyond that, Kevin never really seemed to show off any of Grey Matter's intelligence. He very well may have had it, but maybe it's his brashness and ego limiting how intelligent he comes across, particularly if his ego's challenged. Otherwise, to my memory, we never get to see him use Upgrade's abilities or Ghost Freaks. I would have loved to see the intangibility especially. Though seeing as all of these are only a tenth of as powerful as the original aliens, maybe his body just doesn't line up quite well enough with Ghost Freak's bits and pieces to go intangible. In order of appearance, the next amalgam we see is from the Classic series future timeline with Kevin's future self in Kevin 11,000. After being trapped in the Null Void, presumably since the Classic series, 20 or 30 odd years later, Kevin's had a lot of time to absorb a subsequent just shy of 11,000 additional aliens to gain their powers. 10% of their abilities or not, once you've got enough in combination, that's a pretty solid accumulative effect. As a quick aside, his son Devlin can for whatever reason transform into Kevin's original amalgam form with no explanation. Maybe he had Devlin when that's all he'd absorbed, and the DNA there was passed down to his son who could regulate the DNA better, going in and out of the form at will. Back to it though, future Kevin's amalgam form is such a treat. When we're introduced to this future Kevin, he's back in his human form, clearly demonstrating that he's gained the ability to revert back to normal. Then, to our surprise, in that human form, taps into alien abilities with accelerated speed. And when confronted by Ben, turns into his new amalgam form, which is a much more monstrous take on the original form, being a lot more heat blast than anything else for whatever reason. I'm not complaining though, from a purely visual standpoint, I like this one even better than the classic one, though generally the original is my favourite. This version is even more top-heavy somehow. You lose some alien components in a design, but get even more exaggerated bits and pieces from the ones that are there. I particularly like how the forearms elements come through on this one, and I'd love to see the creature where he gets this new uneven wing from. What this design does so effectively is feel powerful even before you see just how powerful it really is. Even when beaten into the ground by what we assume at this point in the series is Ben's most powerful alien and way big, he just gets right back up like nothing happened. Very sort of proto-Agrigor getting up after Humongousaur hit him a bunch. Despite maybe being overwhelmed by way big in the moment, he feels like he's completely unharmed, only eventually being beaten by being sent back to the Null Void, where presumably he'll only absorb more species and get stronger and more monstrous. Moving on to the Ultimate Alien Force era, in order to defeat Agrigor, Kevin absorbs the Ultimatrix. Strangely enough, and something I only really realised recently, not getting any components that remotely resemble any of the Ultimate Aliens. I would have really loved to see those Ultimate Alien designs worked into there, or at least have it explained why we don't see them. I found out while researching for this video that this form was called Ultimate Kevin. Very fitting, but not something I'd remembered from the show. This amalgam, more than anything else, represents Kevin's inner struggle and gives us this great little story arc that goes down a particularly dark path, much more so than the rest of the series at this point, resulting in a Ben that was prepared to kill Kevin if it came down to it. Up until this point, this Ultimate Amalgam really felt like it packed the biggest punch. Between this and the classic series iteration, it doesn't really feel like there's much competition. It should go without saying, but just to be safe, he's made up of the Ultimate Alien era roster. I particularly like the Lodestar shoulder piece coming out of Swampfire's arm with Wrath's knuckle detail. Those three elements work so cohesively together, and they're not the only bit that's sort of blended in nicely. I personally find this one the least visually appealing so far, despite liking how each of the elements fit together, with some elements being more blended together than others while still having that segmented feel. And the half jet ray brow is a nice touch. Before we move on to the next one, I have to take a moment to mention how good the fight between Ultimate Kevin and Ultimate Echo Echo was. Now moving on to what I think is tied for my second favourite amalgam form, with the Omniverse flashback we see during the Rooters arc. This amalgam being made up from all the subsequent alien species introduced to the classic series, giving us a much more horrific, monstrous design, with what feels like a pretty decent jump in overall power. Despite feeling like the most hodgepodge thrown together design with the most segmented feel, it somehow feels the most cohesive. I think the Frankenstrike details really aided in that. If I'm being picky, I don't love the way big head fin on the model sheet, but in motion it works great. It'd be easy to list the bits and pieces that don't work, but just everything here does. The way Ditto blends in with Cannonbolt, which blends in nicely with Eye-Guy, which doesn't blend with Frankenstrike, but works so nicely, which ties in with Arctic Guana, it's hard not to love. Also, Upchuck and Wildvine having those green elements works nicely. I'd like to keep gushing over this, and then I remember this was in the series for a single scene, and even then, it's a single action set piece. Beyond being visually great, since he's only in one scene I'm going to talk about it, the fight itself, as expected in Omniverse, is so well choreographed, and it's a great little answer to what if Kevin absorbed the additional aliens in the classic series. Although I'd quite like to see a fusion between this and the original classic amalgam. That's a side tangent in itself. The other component about the scene featuring this design is just how well it demonstrates the madness that absorbing too much energy causes for Kevin. Having that madness terrify the other amalgam kids made all the more frightening given how inherently spooky this form is. Moving on to what is by a mile my least favourite amalgam form, with the current day Omniverse amalgam. Looking at it now, especially a still of it, I think I've worked out what I don't like about it. It comes down to two or sort of three elements. Everything else is great. The crash hopper legs, the buzzshock torso, the additional limbs work. The more mismatched limbs are great. The blocks and Gravitac details balance them out nicely, especially the blocks bit being more bulky like the classic series Heat Blast arm. I'd say a small criticism is the wings don't work for me. I wouldn't have minded the Pesky Dust wings being so small since Pesky Dust is so little, but the Aerodactyl one just feels too small to support the rest of his body. I wouldn't have minded if they were sort of a bit mismatched and disproportionate like the Kevin 11,000 design. But what I really don't like about this design is his face is so close to his human form and that ball weevil headpiece looks horrid to me. I think it could have been worked into his face more effectively. It almost looks like Kevin's painted his face grey and done a dress up. Beyond that, I think I like it more now than what I originally did going into this video. This form also brings with it that great reveal that Kevin learnt to control the madness and remains in control, choosing to revert back to his human form. Which, along with being a nice little character moment, makes me think you could assume he may be able to return to that form like with Kevin 11,000. Though maybe it's just the chin scar and the suit making me think that. Either way, I've had a lot of fun with this video if it isn't obvious. Along with everything Andromeda Galaxy, this is probably my favourite aspect of Ben 10. Kevin's an amazing character and these forms are one of the best bits about him. Maybe I'll have to touch on his character more in its own video. If you have any thoughts or feelings at all, let me know. Otherwise, if you've made it this far, I appreciate that. Thanks for watching.